Next, let's talk about set-driven key. Set-driven key is actually very similar to animating. If we've had any experience with animation before, we'll know that when we animate, we're actually setting multiple keyframes for an object to achieve complex animation result. Set-driven key is very similar in this regard. We also set multiple keyframes for the driven object to achieve complex animation result. The only difference is that with animation, we rely on the timeline to drive the different keyframes. But set-driven key relies on the change in the driver attributes value to drive the final behavior. So let's do a set-driven key together first. I have a driver object here and a driven object. There are different ways to open the set-driven key interface. One way is we can switch to the animation menu set. Then find key here, and inside there's set-driven key. Then find set inside that. This will pop up the set-driven key window. But as we can see with this method, it's very troublesome to find. Especially as riggers, we have to switch to the animation menu set. It's very inconvenient. What's another way to do it? We can just select any object, it doesn't matter which one, and select any attribute. It doesn't matter, but we must select one, because if we don't, this window cannot be selected. Then we click Edit, and in here is Set-Driven Key. Let's click it. This will also bring up the same interface. Next, let's look at this window. This window is split into upper and lower parts. We can see the top is our driver, and the bottom is the driven. It's similar to our connection editor. It also supports having multiple objects loaded in. For example, if I duplicate multiple objects, select all of them, we see at the bottom there's a button called Load Driver. If we click it, we'll see the names of these three objects appear in this top list. When we select each one, it will show its corresponding attributes. The same operation applies to the driven objects. I'll select this, and at the bottom here, click Load Driven. It will also have its attributes and corresponding names. Let's delete them all. We don't need these for now. Let's reload our original ones. We'll see on the right, it only displays keyable attributes. If we want to use some different attributes to drive it, we can do that. We just need to go into Options here and find Show Non-Keyable Attributes. Check that. Now we can see all the attributes are here. But from my experience, we rarely use non-keyable attributes. So let's turn that back off. And let's create a very simple effect. We'll use the left box x-axis translation. And through its movement, we'll control the right box y-axis translation. The driver attribute is our x-axis translation. The driven attribute is the driven object's y-axis translation. Look, when we have both of these selected, this key button in the bottom left becomes selectable. Let's click it. Now we can see in my driven object's y-axis attribute, it has a blue box. We need to distinguish this from the constraints box color. Let's compare them. This set-driven key blue color is a bit darker. The constraints blue is much lighter. Okay, so now we have this connection. Now when I move the x-axis, nothing happens. Why? Because we've only set one keyframe. One keyframe isn't enough to make our object move. We need to set a second keyframe. So here, let's move it forward by 5 units. Notice I'm moving the driver object's x-axis, and correspondingly, we need to move the driven object. Let's move the driven object up by 5 units. Now let's click this key button again. This way we have 2 keyframes. In theory, it should start animating now. Let's check it out. When I move the left object's x-axis from 0 to 5, we can see the driven object has a corresponding animation. As we mentioned before, set-driven key is very similar to animating. It's all about setting these keyframes. So we can also use the animation interface to edit it. So look here. When I select my driven object, and then in Windows Animation Editors, there's the graph editor. Let's open it. Here we'll enter an animation curve editing menu. The operations here are exactly the same as in animation. Because our course has limited time, if we're not very familiar with the graph editor's operations, I'll suggest finding some animation tutorials to watch to see exactly how to adjust things in here. Here, let's just talk about some of the ones we use most often. First is that we can change the shape of the curve. Look, when I select a point, it has a manipulator handle. This handle, we can also use the middle mouse button to change its tangent direction, and in doing so, change the shape of the curve. When doing set-driven key, most of the time we just use a linear form. So let's select everything and find this middle button here. We'll change it to a straight line. This is what we use often. Now let's take another look at this effect. We'll notice one thing. When we go from 0 to 5, there's an animation there. But when we go past 5, it doesn't have that behavior anymore. It just stops here. This is also easy to understand, because we only have 2 keyframes. Beyond this range, it won't have any effect. So what if we wanted to still have an effect outside this range? We can still use this animation. Here, let's maximize this. We'll select our curve. And we see on the right, it has these settings for the curve's behavior on the left and right. If we click this one, we'll see it just keeps repeating the same shape. We can also click the one on the right. This way, if we look again, when I move it, we'll see it's constantly within this 0 to 5 range, doing a looping action. What if we don't want that? What if we want it to inherit its last position? We still select this object and select our curve. Here we'll use the other 2 buttons. This way we see its line becomes infinite. And now if we look, when I move it, it just keeps going up and down. Another thing is, we can also use the graph editor to change the values of the driven key. When we select a point, we'll see up here it says 5 and 5. The 5 on the left represents the keyframe value of the driver's attribute. We should remember our driver object's x translation was from 0 to 5. So this is our x-axis is 0 to 5. And the 5 on the right is the driven object's 5. For example, let's change it to 10. When I set my driver object's x-axis to 5, my driven object's y-axis will become 10. This is also a place where we can make modifications using the graph editor. Similarly, we can also change the driver object's value. Right now it's 5. Let's change it to 3. Now let's see. When I change it to 3, we'll see it now becomes 10. So that is our explanation of set-driven key. Set-driven key is mainly used to create some more complex animation effects. But at the same time, we want the animator to control it with a very simple value. For example, the Mach transformations we often see in movies. For example, the armor on a person's arm, through continuous part changes, eventually transforms into a gun. This kind of animation is generally preset by us during production. What the animator needs to do is just use a single 0 to 1 attribute to turn it on or off. We could say set-driven key is a very useful function in specific situations. But most of the time, for rigging, we'll still use attribute connections more often.